Hi there, have you ever trusted someone so much, only to realize they were the reason your life was falling apart? My name is Barbara Mitchell, I'm 29, and I thought I had it all. A dream home in Texas, a loving husband, and a perfect father-in-law. But behind his warm smile, he was weaving a trap, controlling my meals, disguising insults as advice, until the day I uncovered a truth so dark, it shattered everything I believed about family. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and thank you for being here. I work as a freelance graphic designer from home. I married Jake Mitchell 2 years ago. He's a software engineer at Dell, the kind of guy who can fix your Wi-Fi, but also remembers to bring you coffee in bed. We live in this gorgeous neighborhood where everyone knows each other, where the houses have perfect lawns and the community pool is always sparkling clean. From the outside, it probably looked like we had everything figured out. And honestly, I thought we did too, until I realized that Jake's father, Bob, wasn't the loving patriarch he pretended to be. Bob was something much darker. Bob Mitchell is 58, a retired police detective who now works as a security consultant. After his wife died 3 years ago, he threw himself into being the perfect father to his only son. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair that's always perfectly styled. The kind of man who wears polo shirts and khakis even to casual barbecues, who knows everyone's name in the neighborhood, who offers to help before you even know you need it. He lives 3 houses down from us in a single-story ranch that's maintained to absolute perfection. The lawn is always trimmed to exactly the same height. The flower beds are weeded with military precision. His garage workshop is organized like something out of a home improvement magazine, with tools arranged by size and function. Even his mailbox is polished to a shine. For the first year of our marriage, I genuinely tried to see him the way Jake did. The devoted single father who sacrificed everything to raise his son after his wife's tragic car accident. The helpful neighbor who knew how to fix anything from leaky faucets to computer problems. The charming widower who made everyone laugh at community events with his stories from his police days. He had this way of making himself indispensable to everyone around him. When the Johnsons' teenager crashed their car, Bob was there with his insurance expertise. When Mrs. Chen's house was burglarized, Bob helped her navigate the police report and recommended security upgrades. When the HOA needed someone to organize the annual block party, Bob volunteered and made it the best one in years. Everyone in Westlake Hills loved Bob Mitchell. He was the unofficial patriarch of our little suburban paradise. But it's what people do when they think no one's watching that reveals who they really are. And Bob? Bob had a way of weaponizing kindness that took me far too long to recognize. I remember the first time I really noticed it. We were at the annual neighborhood barbecue, one of those perfect Texas spring evenings, where everyone brings a side dish and the beer flows freely. The whole community was there, families with kids running around, couples my age mixing margaritas, retirees sharing stories from their lawn chairs. Jake was manning the grill with a couple of other guys, laughing about something work-related. I was chatting with some neighbors about a new boutique that had opened in downtown Austin when Bob appeared beside me with a plate. "Here you go, sweetheart," he said, handing me a plate with a small portion of grilled vegetables and a tiny piece of chicken breast. No sauce, no seasoning visible. "I know you're watching your figure," I blinked, looking around at the other women. Margaret Torres had a plate loaded with ribs, potato salad, and cornbread. Lisa Henderson was working on her second helping of brisket. Even elderly Mrs. Patterson had a normal-sized portion of everything. But mine looked like what you'd serve someone who was seriously ill or on a restrictive medical diet. "I wasn't really watching anything," I said, trying to keep my voice light and neighborly. Bob's smile never wavered, that same warm, paternal expression he wore for everyone. "Oh, Jake mentioned you were trying to eat healthier. Smart thinking. Got to stay in shape for when you start making babies, right?" He winked and patted my shoulder. A man wants his wife to stay as beautiful as the day he married her. The conversation around us continued, but I felt frozen. I had never told Jake I was trying to eat healthier. In fact, we'd recently been talking about our goal to try every barbecue joint in Austin. Hardly a health food tour, but Bob said it with such certainty, such paternal authority, that the other women nodded approvingly. "Bob's so thoughtful," Margaret commented. "You're lucky to have such a caring father-in-law." I found myself nodding and thanking him, even though something felt wrong. The confidence in his voice when he spoke about what I supposedly wanted. The way he'd prepared my plate without asking what I actually preferred. The assumption that my eating habits were somehow Jake's business to discuss with his father. But I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe Jake had mentioned something offhandedly. Maybe Bob was just being health conscious. Maybe I was reading too much into a simple act of kindness. That moment set the tone for everything that came after. The incidents started small, so subtle that I questioned whether they were incidents at all. Bob would drop by unannounced, always with some reasonable excuse. He'd bring groceries when Jake mentioned we were running low on something. He'd show up to help with yard work before we'd even realized it needed doing. He'd appear with his toolbox whenever anything in our house made an unusual sound. "Just looking out for my kids," he'd say, with that warm smile. "It's what family does." If he brought lunch during these visits, mine would somehow be different. Smaller portions, blander ingredients, or missing components entirely. When he brought Chinese takeout, Jake got kung pao chicken, and I got steamed vegetables with plain rice. When he picked up barbecue, Jake got a loaded plate, and I got sliced turkey breast with no sauce. "Didn't want to give you anything too heavy," he'd explain. "You seem like you have a delicate stomach." I'd never complained about stomach issues. I'd grown up eating spicy food and could handle anything from Thai curry to Mexican street tacos. But Bob spoke with such conviction that I started doubting my own digestive history. When Jake traveled for work, which happened frequently in his job, Bob's visits increased. He had a spare key that Jake had given him for emergencies, and he'd let himself in to help around the house. I'd come downstairs from my home office to find him organizing our pantry according to his own system, or fixing appliances that were working perfectly fine. "Barbara's been so stressed with deadlines," he'd tell Jake when my husband returned. "I've been keeping an eye on her, making sure she remembers to eat." The thing was, I wasn't particularly stressed. I actually loved my work and was good at managing my schedule. But Bob painted this picture of me as scatterbrained and overwhelmed that Jake began to accept as reality. "I'm glad Dad's looking out for you when I'm gone," Jake would say. "You know how you get when you're focused on a project." But I didn't get any particular way. This was a narrative Bob was creating and Jake was buying into. The gifts started about 6 months into our marriage. Always thoughtful, always expensive, always carrying an underlying message that I wasn't quite good enough as I was. A gym membership to an exclusive women's fitness center across town. "Thought you might want to tone up before trying for grandkids," Bob explained to Jake, right in front of me at Sunday dinner. "Barbara's got good bones, but she could use some definition." Prenatal vitamins, even though Jake and I had only mentioned in passing that we might want kids someday. "It's never too early to start preparing your body," Bob said. "You want to give my son healthy babies, don't you?" A cookbook titled "Quick and Healthy Meals for Busy Wives," with a note inside. "For when you're ready to expand beyond takeout. Jake deserves home cooking like his mother used to make." A subscription to a meal delivery service that specialized in portion-controlled, low-calorie meals. "I noticed you've been looking a little peaked," Bob explained. "This will take the guesswork out of proper nutrition." Each gift came with that same benevolent smile, that same tone of helpful fatherly concern. But they felt like criticisms wrapped in expensive paper. Messages that I was too thin, too fat, too lazy, too incompetent, too something that required fixing. Jake never seemed to notice the patterns, or maybe he didn't want to see them. "Dad means well," he'd say every time I tried to bring up how the gifts made me feel. "He raised me alone after Mom died. He just wants to help. He wants us to be happy." But they feel like insults, I tried to explain after the cookbook incident. "You're being too sensitive," Jake replied. "He spent his own money to try to help you. The least you can do is appreciate the thought." But I started paying attention to other patterns too. How Bob had opinions about every aspect of our life together. Our social calendar, our home decor choices, even our weekend plans. "Maybe Barbara would be more comfortable staying home tonight," he'd suggest when we mentioned going to a party. "She looked tired earlier. You don't want to push her too hard." I hadn't looked tired. I'd been excited about the party. "Barbara might not understand this kind of event," he'd say about family gatherings or community functions. "She didn't grow up with Texas hospitality like we did." I'd grown up in Oregon, but I'd lived in Texas for 3 years. I understood Southern hospitality just fine. "I'm not sure Barbara's ready for that kind of responsibility," he'd comment, when Jake mentioned wanting to get a dog or take on a home improvement project. She's got her hands full with her little art projects. My little art projects were a successful freelance business that brought in substantial income. But Bob had a way of diminishing everything I did, making it sound like a hobby rather than a career. The most insidious part was how he did all of this in front of Jake, but somehow Jake never heard the condescension. To him, it sounded like his father being protective and caring. To me, it felt like death by 1,000 small cuts. I tried talking to my friends about it, but it was hard to explain. How do you complain about a man who brings you expensive gifts and helps around the house? How do you describe the feeling that someone is systematically undermining you when they never raise their voice or say anything overtly cruel? Maybe he's just set in his ways, my friend Carmen suggested over coffee. Old-fashioned men can be like that. They think they're being helpful. He sounds like he cares about you, my neighbor Lisa said when I mentioned feeling criticized. Not everyone has in-laws who are so involved. But it didn't feel like caring. It felt like something else entirely. Something that made my skin crawl and my stomach clench with anxiety whenever I heard his key in our front door. The breaking point came during what I now call the soup incident. Jake was on a business trip to San Francisco for 3 days, working on some major software rollout that required him to be on site with the client. The night before he left, Bob called while we were having dinner. "Don't you worry about Barbara while you're gone," I heard him tell Jake through the phone. "I'll check on her, make sure she's eating right and not working too hard." I wanted to object. I was a 29-year-old woman with a college degree and a successful business, not a child who needed supervision, but Jake seemed genuinely relieved by his father's offer. "Thanks, Dad. You know how she gets when she's stressed with deadlines. Sometimes she forgets to take care of herself." I stared at him. When had I ever forgotten to take care of myself? When had I ever given him the impression that I couldn't handle a few days alone? But Jake was already moving on, discussing flight times and client expectations, and the moment passed. On the second day of Jake's trip, I was deep in work on a major project for a new client, a tech startup that wanted a complete brand identity package. It was exactly the kind of high-profile job I'd been working toward, and I was in that flow state where everything was clicking perfectly. That's when Bob knocked on the door. Through the front window, I could see him holding a large thermos and a paper bag from our local bakery. He was dressed in his usual casual perfection, pressed khakis, a polo shirt that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle, boat shoes without a scuff mark. "Brought you some lunch, sweetheart," he announced when I opened the door. "Can't have you wasting away while my boy's gone." I glanced at the kitchen clock. It was only 11:30 a.m. I hadn't even thought about lunch yet. "That's so thoughtful, Bob, but you really didn't need to." "Nonsense," he cut me off, already walking past me into the house like he owned it. "A man takes care of his family. That includes daughters-in-law." He made himself at home in our kitchen, opening cabinets to find bowls and spoons. The thermos contained homemade chicken soup that smelled incredible, rich and savory with herbs I couldn't identify. The bag held fresh sourdough bread from Austin's most expensive artisanal bakery, and a small container of what looked like homemade chocolate chip cookies. "This smells amazing," I admitted as he served me a generous bowl. "What's your secret?" Bob's eyes twinkled with pride. "Family recipe. Jake's mother's, actually. She made this for him whenever he was feeling under the weather. Always did the trick." He buttered a thick slice of bread for me and set it on a small plate alongside the soup. Then, instead of leaving me to eat in peace, he sat down across from me at our kitchen island like he was supervising my meal. The soup was good, really good, but there was something slightly off about the taste. A bitter undertone that didn't quite belong with the savory chicken and vegetables. It reminded me of the aftertaste you get from certain medications, or the way food tastes when you're getting sick. "Everything okay?" Bob asked, watching me intently. "You're not eating much." "It's delicious," I said, managing another spoonful. "I'm just not very hungry yet." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You need to eat more, Barbara. You're getting too thin." "Jake mentioned he's worried about your weight." That was news to me. Jake had never mentioned any concerns about my weight. If anything, he'd been encouraging me to indulge more, suggesting we try new restaurants and bringing home treats from his favorite food trucks. I managed about half the bowl before my stomach started feeling unsettled. "I think I'm getting full," I said, pushing the bowl away. Bob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You barely touched it. This is exactly what Jake's worried about, you not taking care of yourself." I am taking care of myself, I protested. I just finish the soup, Barbara. His voice carried a note of authority I'd never heard before. Not a request, a command. I didn't spend all morning cooking for you to waste it. Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to eat a few more spoonfuls before claiming I needed to get back to work. Bob lingered for another 20 minutes, making small talk about the neighborhood and asking pointed questions about my project deadline that felt more like interrogation than conversation. After he finally left, I tried to get back into my creative flow, but something felt wrong. My stomach was churning in a way that had nothing to do with normal hunger or fullness. There was a heaviness in my limbs, a slight dizziness that made it hard to focus on my computer screen. 2 hours after Bob left, the real symptoms hit. Sharp, stabbing cramps in my stomach that doubled me over at my desk. Waves of nausea that sent me running to the bathroom. For the next 6 hours, I was sicker than I'd ever been in my adult life. Shaking, feverish, unable to keep even water down. Every time I thought the worst had passed, another wave would hit. I spent most of the evening curled up on our bathroom floor, too weak to make it back to bed. The cool tiles felt good against my burning skin, and I dozed fitfully between bouts of illness. When Jake called that evening for our usual check-in, I could barely speak coherently. "Barbara, you sound terrible. What's wrong?" "Food poisoning," I whispered, my voice hoarse from being sick. Really bad. "Oh God. Do you need me to come home? I can catch a red-eye." "No, don't. I'll be okay. Just need to ride it out." But Jake must have called his father immediately after we hung up, because Bob appeared at our door within 15 minutes, letting himself in with his key. "Oh, honey," he said, finding me still on the bathroom floor. "What happened? Jake said you're sick." "Food poisoning," I managed. His face creased with concern. "Did you eat something bad? We need to be careful. There have been warnings about that new sushi place downtown." I hadn't eaten sushi. In fact, other than his soup, I hadn't eaten anything that day except a piece of toast for breakfast. Bob helped me to bed, bringing me water and saltine crackers from our kitchen. He found a thermometer and took my temperature, 101.3 degrees Celsius, then called his doctor friend to ask about over-the-counter medications for food poisoning. He even dampened washcloths with cool water and placed them on my forehead. The perfect concerned father-in-law, the devoted family man taking care of his sick daughter-in-law. When Jake got home the next afternoon, cutting his business trip short, Bob was still there. He'd apparently spent the night on our couch, keeping watch, in case I took a turn for the worse. "Thank God you were here, Dad," Jake said, embracing his father. "What if she'd gotten really dehydrated and no one found her?" "That's what family does," Bob replied. "We take care of each other." I was still too weak to participate much in the conversation, but I heard them talking in low voices about my fragile constitution and how I needed to be more careful about what I ate. Bob suggested I see a doctor about possible food allergies or digestive issues. "She's always been sensitive," I heard Jake say. "Maybe she needs to stick to blander foods." But I'd never been particularly sensitive to food. I'd traveled internationally, eaten street food in Mexico, enjoyed spicy cuisine from half a dozen cultures. This level of illness was completely unprecedented for me. It was while Jake was helping me shower later that day, I was still too shaky to stand for long, that I remembered something. I'd been so sick that I'd completely forgotten about cleaning up the kitchen. The thermos Bob had brought was still sitting in our sink, and I'd been too ill to deal with it. When I was finally steady enough to walk around the house, I went to rinse out the thermos. That's when I found something odd in our trash can. Buried under other garbage was an empty container of chicken broth. I pulled it out and checked the expiration date. 8 months expired. I stared at that date for a full minute, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. The soup had tasted off because it was made with broth that had gone bad almost a year ago. But this wasn't just any expired broth. It was a brand that we kept in our own pantry. I checked our pantry. All of our broth containers were current, recently purchased during my last major grocery run. This expired container had come from somewhere else. When I confronted Bob about it the next day, his explanation was smooth and immediate. "Oh, that old thing. I was cleaning out my pantry and must have grabbed the wrong container by mistake. These old eyes aren't what they used to be, you know," he chuckled self-deprecatingly. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I feel terrible that my carelessness made you sick. But something didn't add up. The container wasn't just expired. It was from a brand that Bob didn't use. I'd been to his house dozens of times, helped him put away groceries on several occasions. He was loyal to specific brands, and this wasn't one of them. More troubling was how clean the container was. If it had been sitting in someone's pantry for 8 months past its expiration date, it should have shown some signs of age, dust, faded labels, something. This one looked like it had been recently handled. When I tried to discuss my concerns with Jake, he sighed like I was being dramatic. "It was an accident, Barbara. Do you really think my dad would make you sick on purpose?" The way he phrased it made me sound paranoid and ungrateful. But looking back, I was starting to think that yes, maybe Bob would make me sick on purpose. Not to seriously harm me, but to prove some kind of point about my weakness or unsuitability for his son. But I had no proof, just a feeling and an expired broth container that could easily be explained as an honest mistake. That's when I decided to call my sister Lisa. Lisa is 2 years younger than me, lives in San Francisco, and works in cybersecurity for a major tech company. She's always been the more paranoid one between us, the one who reads privacy policies, uses VPNs, covers her laptop camera with tape, and assumes the worst about people's digital intentions. But her paranoia has served her well professionally. She's caught data breaches before they became major problems, identified security vulnerabilities that could have cost millions, and built her reputation on assuming that if something can be exploited, someone will try to exploit it. When I called her that evening, I meant to just vent about my frustrating father-in-law situation. Instead, I found myself telling her everything. The gifts that felt like insults, the comments that undermined my confidence, the way Bob seemed to be systematically convincing Jake that I was weak, unreliable, and unsuitable. And then I told her about the soup. There was a long silence on the other end of our video call. Lisa was sitting in her apartment in the Mission District, her laptop open beside her, probably working even though it was past 9 p.m. her time. "Barbara," she said finally, "you need to set up cameras." "What?" "Lisa, this isn't some crime drama." "Maybe not yet. But if he's really doing what you think he's doing, you need proof, especially if Jake's still in denial." She leaned forward, her face serious on my laptop screen. "Think about it from a security perspective. You have someone who has access to your home, who has established patterns of behavior that make you uncomfortable, and who may have already caused you physical harm. Whether it's intentional or not, you need to document what's actually happening." I started to protest that it felt like overkill, but Lisa cut me off. "You're a graphic designer, right? You understand the importance of documentation in client relationships. This is the same principle. If Bob is really just being helpful and you're misinterpreting his actions, the cameras will show that. But if something else is going on..." She was right, and I hated that she was right. But I also knew that without evidence, I was just the paranoid daughter-in-law making accusations against the beloved family patriarch. "I don't know the first thing about surveillance equipment," I admitted. Lisa's smile was slightly predatory. "Lucky for you, I do." 3 days later, a package arrived addressed to me at a P.O. box I'd rented across town. I'd told Jake I was using it for some freelance work that required a separate business address. Technically true, since I was treating this like a very personal security project. Inside the package were 6 cameras, each no bigger than a large button, a portable wireless router that could create its own network, a small tablet for monitoring feeds, and detailed instructions in Lisa's precise handwriting. "Wireless, motion-activated, cloud backup," her note explained. "Battery life of 6 to 8 weeks. Mobile app for remote viewing. Everything encrypted and stored on servers Bob can't access even with his police contacts. Don't overthink the placement. Just get coverage of common areas." I spent hours that weekend learning how to use the equipment, while Jake was at a golf tournament with friends. Setting up the wireless network, downloading the monitoring app, testing the camera angles and recording quality. It felt simultaneously like the most paranoid thing I'd ever done, and the most sensible precaution I could take. By the time Jake got home Sunday evening, every common area in our house was under surveillance. Kitchen, living room, dining room, front entryway, my home office, and the area near our bedroom. The cameras were virtually invisible, hidden in light fixtures, behind decorative objects, and inside, fake plants I'd strategically placed around the house. If Bob was really just being helpful, the cameras would prove it. If something else was going on, I'd finally have documentation. That Monday evening, Jake made an announcement that sent chills down my spine. Dad invited us to his fishing cabin next weekend, he said over dinner. East Texas, right on Lake Livingston. He thinks it would be good for you to get away from work stress. The cabin, I'd heard Bob mention it before. His private retreat, miles from the nearest neighbor, where he went to fish and clear his head. If Bob was planning something more serious than expired soup, an isolated cabin would be the perfect place. I've got a major project deadline next week, I started, but Jake's face fell. Come on, babe. You've been so tense lately. Ever since you got sick, you've been jumpy and paranoid. A weekend in nature will be perfect for both of us. Paranoid. The word stung because I was afraid it might be true. Maybe I was reading sinister motives into innocent actions. Maybe Bob really was just trying to help in his own misguided way. But I packed 2 of the portable cameras in my luggage anyway, along with my phone charger and the mobile hotspot Lisa had included in her care package. If nothing happened, I'd have wasted a weekend being suspicious of a harmless old man. If something did happen, I'd be ready. Bob's cabin was exactly as isolated as I'd feared, set on a quiet cove of Lake Livingston about 3 hours east of Austin, surrounded by dense pine forest, with the nearest neighbor at least 5 miles away. The cabin itself was rustic, but well-maintained, with a large screened porch overlooking the water and Bob's pristine fishing boat tied to a private dock. Isn't this perfect? Bob said as we unloaded our bags from Jake's truck. Just family, just peace and quiet. No distractions, no deadlines, no stress. The way he emphasized no distractions made me uncomfortable. No cell service meant no way to call for help. No neighbors meant no witnesses. No escape route except the single dirt road that led back to the main highway. While Jake and Bob talked fishing plans on the porch, I quickly installed my hidden cameras. One in the kitchen area, positioned to capture the food preparation space. Another in the main living area with a view of the dining table. I activated the mobile hotspot and confirmed that both cameras were recording to the cloud. If Bob tried anything, I'd have proof. That first evening felt almost normal. Bob grilled fish he'd caught earlier in the week, made his famous campfire beans, and regaled us with stories from his police days. Tales of domestic disputes that turned dangerous. Drug busts that went sideways, the satisfaction of catching criminals who thought they were smarter than the law. The key to being a good detective, he said, staring into the fire, is understanding that people always reveal their true nature eventually. You just have to be patient and pay attention. But even during these seemingly innocent moments, I noticed things. How Bob prepared my plate separately from Jake's, taking longer over mine and using different utensils. How he watched me eat with too much attention, noting every bite I took or didn't take. How he made sure to personally refill my drink every time, even when I protested that I could get it myself. Barbara's not much of an outdoors girl, he commented to Jake as I swatted away mosquitoes. Maybe next time she'd be more comfortable staying home while we have our father-son time. I'd been camping, hiking, and outdoor adventuring since I was a kid in Oregon. But Bob spoke with such authority that Jake nodded thoughtfully. She does prefer her climate-controlled environments, Jake agreed. No, I didn't. I loved being outside. But somehow Bob was rewriting my preferences in real time, and Jake was accepting this revision without question. The second day brought more concerning developments. Jake slept until almost noon, which was completely unlike him. He's normally an early riser who's up with the sun, especially when we're somewhere new and exciting. But that morning he seemed groggy and disoriented even after multiple cups of coffee. Must be the country air, Bob said, with a chuckle, when I expressed concern. That whiskey I gave him last night was the good stuff. 100 proof from my private collection. Sometimes city boys can't handle the real thing. While Jake slowly came around, Bob announced he was making a special lunch just for me. Let me take care of you, sweetheart. You look peaked. I watched from the porch as he worked in the kitchen, wishing I could see exactly what he was doing. The hidden camera would capture it, but I couldn't access the footage in real time from my phone. The cabin's internet was too spotty for streaming video. The sandwich he brought me looked perfect. Turkey and Swiss on fresh sourdough bread with lettuce, tomato, and what looked like homemade mayo. It smelled normal, looked appetizing, and seemed like a genuinely thoughtful gesture. But when I bit into it, there was that same bitter undertaste I'd noticed in the soup back home. Subtle but unmistakable, like the aftertaste of aspirin or cough medicine. I managed a few bites, then claimed I was full and set the sandwich aside. Bob's jaw tightened in that almost imperceptible way I was learning to recognize. "You need to eat, Barbara. You're wasting away to nothing." "I'm fine," I insisted. "I had a big breakfast." "You had half a piece of toast. That's not breakfast, that's a snack." His voice carried that same commanding tone I'd heard during the soup incident. "Finish the sandwich. I'm really not hungry. Finish it. Not a request. An order." Jake looked up from his coffee, finally alert enough to notice the tension. "Everything okay?" "Your wife doesn't take care of herself," Bob said, his voice tight with frustration. "Look at her. She's skin and bones. How is she supposed to give me grandchildren if she won't eat properly?" The conversation escalated from there, with Bob lecturing me about nutrition while Jake nodded along, apparently accepting his father's assessment of my eating habits. I excused myself and spent the afternoon reading on the porch, claiming I needed some quiet time. But my mind was racing, the bitter taste. Jake's unusual grogginess after Bob's special whiskey, the way Bob insisted I eat food that made me uncomfortable. The pattern was becoming undeniable. That evening, while Bob took Jake fishing for what he called father-son bonding time, I retreated to our bedroom and pulled up the camera footage on my phone. The cabin's Wi-Fi was barely functional, but I managed to download the lunch preparation video. What I saw made my hands shake. The timestamp showed Bob in the kitchen during sandwich preparation. He'd made 2 sandwiches side by side, one straightforward, one with extra steps. For Jake's sandwich, he'd simply assembled the ingredients normally, but for mine, after completing the basic sandwich, he'd carefully opened it back up and sprinkled something over the turkey from a small glass vial. Even through the grainy footage, I could see him talking to himself as he worked. I rewound and watched again, this time with earbuds to catch the audio despite the poor connection. "She'll learn," he was muttering as he added whatever substance was in the vial. "One way or another, she'll learn she doesn't belong here. Jake deserves better than some skinny little artist who can't even take care of herself." The vial went back into his jacket pocket, but not before I caught a glimpse of the label. The resolution wasn't good enough to read it clearly, but I could make out enough letters to do some research. Ipecac. I'd heard of Ipecac before. It was a medication used to induce vomiting, mostly discontinued for safety reasons, but still available in some forms. Parents used to keep it on hand in case their children swallowed something poisonous. Bob had been deliberately making me sick, not just with expired soup, but with actual medication designed to cause nausea and vomiting. This wasn't neglect or carelessness. This was intentional, systematic poisoning. I sat on that bed in the isolated cabin, watching the footage over and over, trying to process what I was seeing. This man, this respected former police officer, this beloved father figure, this pillar of our community, had been systematically drugging me for months. But why? What was his endgame? The answer came that evening during dinner. Bob had prepared what he called his famous chili. The recipe he claimed was from Jake's mother. As we ate, he started talking about family traditions, about keeping the family together, about the importance of not letting outsiders disrupt what had worked for generations. "Your mother and I, we had something special, Jake," he said, his eyes getting distant and slightly manic. "We understood each other completely. She never questioned my judgment, never tried to change our traditions, never pulled me away from what mattered." "Barbara's not trying to change anything, Dad," Jake said, but his voice lacked conviction. Bob's smile was cold and predatory. "Isn't she? When's the last time we had our Sunday dinners just the 2 of us? When's the last time you came fishing without having to negotiate with your wife? When's the last time you made a major decision without checking with Barbara first?" "That's what marriage is," I interjected. "Partners make decisions together." "See?" Bob's voice rose triumphantly. "Right there. She can't even let you speak for yourself anymore. She's isolated you from your family, from your roots, from everything that made you the man you are." The conversation devolved quickly from there, with Bob making increasingly pointed accusations about how I was manipulating Jake, how I didn't understand real family values, how I was too weak and selfish to be a proper wife to a Texas man. "Look at her," he said, gesturing dismissively in my direction. She can barely finish a meal. How is she going to handle pregnancy? How is she going to raise strong children? How is she going to support you through life's real challenges? Each criticism felt like a physical blow, not just because of the words themselves, but because I could see Jake beginning to nod along with some of them. The seeds of doubt that Bob had been planting for months were finally sprouting. I excused myself and went to bed early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fake. Through the thin walls of the cabin, I could hear them talking on the porch late through the thin walls of the cabin. I could hear them talking on the porch late into the night, Bob's voice carrying as he systematically dismantled my character, painting me as a manipulative outsider who was ruining Jake's life piece by piece. And the worst part? I could hear Jake starting to agree with some of it. "She has been different lately," Jake said at one point. "More suspicious, more confrontational. She never used to question your help." "That's because she's showing her true colors," Bob replied. "The honeymoon phase is over, and now you're seeing who she really is. Ungrateful, paranoid, unable to appreciate family." I lay in that bed, listening to my husband discuss my supposed flaws with his father, and realized that Bob's plan was working perfectly. He'd been systematically undermining my credibility for months, making me appear weak and unreliable through careful poisoning, then positioning himself as the concerned family member, trying to help Jake see the truth. It was diabolical in its simplicity, and it was working. The final straw came on our last morning at the cabin. I woke up feeling anxious and on edge. Jake was still deeply asleep beside me. More evidence of whatever Bob had been putting in his evening drinks to keep him compliant and groggy. Through our bedroom window, I could see Bob already up and moving around the kitchen area, preparing what he'd announced the night before would be his farewell breakfast. "Special pancakes with my homemade syrup," he'd said. "Just like I used to make for Jake when he was little, a real Mitchell family tradition." I slipped out of bed and positioned myself where I could see into the kitchen through the window. Bob was indeed making pancakes, but I watched him prepare 3 distinct plates. 2 got normal pancakes with what looked like regular maple syrup. The third, mine, based on the smaller portions, got pancakes that looked identical but syrup from a different container. As he worked, Bob produced a small brown bottle from his jacket pocket, the same type of bottle I'd seen in the sandwich video. He added several drops of whatever was inside to my syrup, stirring it carefully to ensure even distribution. Then he looked directly at my window and smiled. He knew I was watching. He wanted me to see what he was doing. This wasn't about secrecy anymore. It was about power. About showing me that he could poison me right in front of my face and there was nothing I could do about it, because no one would believe me. When he brought the plates out to the porch, mine smelled different from the others. Under the sweet maple scent was something sharper, more chemical. Something that made my nose burn slightly and my stomach clench with recognition. "Eat up, sweetheart," Bob said, settling into his chair to watch me with obvious anticipation. "I made this batch of syrup extra special just for you." Jake was already digging into his breakfast, praising his father's cooking with the enthusiasm of someone who'd grown up on these weekend traditions. Bob kept staring at me, waiting for me to take a bite, his eyes bright with malicious excitement. I cut a piece of pancake, loaded it with the doctored syrup, and raised the fork to my mouth. Bob's entire body tensed with anticipation, like a cat watching a mouse approach a trap. Then I set the fork down. "Actually, I'm not very hungry this morning," I said as calmly as I could manage. "I think I'll just stick with coffee." Bob's carefully constructed mask slipped completely. His face darkened with rage, and for a moment I saw him as he really was, not a caring father-in-law, but a controlling predator whose prey had just refused to cooperate. "You need to eat, Barbara." His voice was low and dangerous. "You're nothing but skin and bones. It's embarrassing." "I'm fine, really." He reached across the table and pushed my plate closer to me, his fingers gripping the edge so hard his knuckles went white. "Eat!" The command hung in the air between us, not a request or a suggestion, but a direct order from a man who was used to being obeyed without question. Jake looked up from his own plate, finally registering the tension. "What's going on?" Jake asked, confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere. This was it, my moment of truth. I could back down, eat the poisoned pancakes, and continue playing the role of the grateful daughter-in-law who accepted abuse as love. or I could finally stand up and tell the truth, knowing that Bob would deny everything and Jake might not believe me. "No," I said quietly but firmly. "I'm not eating that." Bob's facade cracked completely. "What did you say?" I said no. "I'm not eating food that you've tampered with." Jake set down his fork, looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. "Tampered with? Barbara, what are you talking about?" I stood up, pulled out my phone, and opened the video app where I'd saved the cabin footage. "Your father has been poisoning me, Jake. Systematically, deliberately, for months." Bob shot to his feet so fast his chair fell backward. "That's ridiculous. You're being hysterical." "Am I?" I held up my phone, showing the screen to Jake. "Let me show you what hysterical actually looks like." The video played on my phone screen, grainy but clear enough to see Bob adding unknown substances to my food, while muttering about teaching me lessons. Jake's face went white as he watched, his mouth falling open in shock and disbelief. "Dad," Jake said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is this?" Bob's mask was completely gone now. His face was twisted with rage and desperation. All pretense of caring father-in-law abandoned. "She doesn't belong here, son. She's poison, real poison. She's taking you away from your family, from everything I built for us, from everything your mother would have wanted." By literally poisoning her, Jake's voice cracked with emotion. "I was trying to show you what she really is," Bob shouted. "Weak, unreliable, not worthy of the Mitchell name. I raised you to be strong, to choose strong women, and you bring home this fragile little flower who can't handle real life." "You made her sick," Jake said, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the wooden porch. "You made me think she was unstable, unhealthy, when you were the one making her sick. Because she is unstable. Look at her now, accusing me of ridiculous things, recording private family moments like some kind of spy. Is this the woman you want raising your children? Is this the woman who can stand beside a Mitchell man through life's real challenges?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stared at his father like he was seeing him for the first time, and maybe he was. The man who had raised him, who had been his hero and role model, had just admitted to systematically poisoning his wife to prove she wasn't good enough for the family. "Pack your things," Jake said finally, his voice hollow. "We're leaving. Now." "Son, please, you don't understand." "Don't." Jake held up a hand to stop him. "Don't call me son. Don't try to explain this away. A father doesn't do this. A father doesn't hurt the people his child loves to prove some twisted point about family loyalty." We packed in tense silence, Bob alternating between attempts at justification and outright begging. He followed us to the truck, his voice becoming increasingly desperate as he realized he was losing his son forever. "Everything I did was for you, Jake, to protect you, to make sure you didn't make the same mistake I did with your mother, choosing someone who wasn't strong enough, who couldn't handle being a Mitchell wife." Jake stopped loading our bags and turned to face his father. "What mistake with Mom?" Bob's face went pale as he realized what he'd just revealed. I didn't mean." "What mistake, Dad?" Jake's voice was deadly quiet. The truth came spilling out then, years of resentment and control finally bursting through Bob's carefully constructed facade. How Jake's mother had wanted to leave Bob in the months before her death. How she'd been making plans to take Jake and start over somewhere else. How the car accident that killed her had happened while she was driving to a lawyer's office to discuss divorce proceedings. "She was going to take you from me," Bob said, tears streaming down his face. "Just like Barbara is trying to do now. I couldn't let that happen again. I couldn't lose you too." The car accident hadn't been an accident at all. Bob had tampered with his wife's brakes, intending to scare her into staying. Instead, he'd killed her, and he'd spent the last 20 years justifying it to himself as protecting his family. Jake stumbled backward like he'd been physically struck. You killed Mom?" "It was an accident. I just wanted her to stop and think, to realize how dangerous it was to drive when she was emotional. I never meant for her to." Jake vomited right there in the driveway. Then he grabbed our bags, threw them in the truck, and we left Bob standing alone at his isolated cabin, finally exposed for what he really was. We drove home in complete silence. Jake gripped the steering wheel so hard I was afraid he might crash us too, his whole body shaking with rage and grief and the devastating realization that his entire childhood had been built on lies. The next morning, I walked into the Austin Police Department with my phone full of evidence and a story that sounded like something out of a psychological thriller. The officer on duty, Detective Martinez, listened to everything with growing amazement. "Ma'am," she said after reviewing some of the footage, "this qualifies as aggravated assault, criminal poisoning, and possibly attempted murder depending on what substances he was using. You're definitely pressing charges?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "And there might be other victims. I was right about that." Within a week of Bob's arrest, other women started coming forward with similar stories. The investigation revealed a pattern going back decades. Women who had dated or married men Bob considered his had mysteriously fallen ill, suffered accidents, or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Margaret Torres, our neighbor, revealed that Bob had systematically harassed her when she'd briefly dated a divorced man Bob considered part of his territory. She'd received gifts of food that made her violently sick, found her car vandalized, and dealt with mysterious reports to child services about her parenting. But the biggest revelation came when Emily Parker called from Colorado, Jake's ex-fiancée, the woman who'd broken their engagement suddenly 5 years ago and moved away without explanation. "He did the same thing to me," she told Detective Martinez over the phone. "The gifts, the comments about not being good enough for Jake, the food that made me sick. But it was worse than that. He threatened me." Emily's story was chilling. Bob had escalated from subtle poisoning to overt threats when she'd tried to tell Jake what was happening. He'd followed her, broken into her apartment, and finally cornered her in a parking garage with explicit threats about what would happen if she didn't leave town immediately. "He told me exactly how my car could have an accident, just like Jake's mother's did," Emily said. "He described it in detail, how brake lines could be cut, how it would look completely natural. He said he'd already done it once to protect his son, and he wouldn't hesitate to do it again." That's when Emily realized Bob had murdered his own wife. She'd left Austin the next day and never looked back, but she'd spent years wondering if she should have reported him. Now she was ready to testify. The investigation expanded to include Jake's mother's death. Her car was exhumed from the junkyard where it had been stored, and forensic analysis confirmed that the brake lines had been deliberately compromised. Bob Mitchell, respected former police detective and pillar of the community, was a murderer who had spent 2 decades covering up his crime. He was charged with first-degree murder in his wife's death, multiple counts of assault and attempted poisoning related to me and the other women, stalking, harassment, and a dozen other charges. Faced with overwhelming evidence and testimony from multiple victims, he pled guilty to avoid the death penalty. At his sentencing hearing, Bob finally showed his true face to the world. Gone was the charming, helpful neighbor. In his place was a bitter, controlling man who felt justified in every horrible thing he'd done. "I protected my family," he said to the judge. "Everything I did was to protect what mattered most. These women were threats to my son's happiness, to our family legacy. I regret that some of them got hurt, but I don't regret defending what was mine." He got life in prison without the possibility of parole for his wife's murder, plus 30 additional years for his crimes against other women. At 58 years old, Bob Mitchell would die in prison. But the legal resolution didn't fix the emotional devastation he'd left in his wake. Jake and I spent months in therapy, both together and separately. Jake had to process the reality that his father, the man he'd idolized, the parent he'd trusted above all others, had murdered his mother and spent 20 years lying about it. He'd systematically abused his wife, and Jake had enabled it by refusing to see what was happening right in front of him. "I should have protected you," Jake said, during one particularly difficult therapy session. "I should have believed you instead of making excuses for him." He was an expert manipulator, our therapist reminded him. He spent decades perfecting these techniques. He knew exactly how to present himself as the concerned father while undermining Barbara's credibility. But knowing that intellectually didn't make the guilt any easier for Jake to bear. He'd chosen his father's word over mine repeatedly, dismissing my concerns as paranoia, while Bob was literally poisoning me at our dining room table. I had my own trauma to work through. Months of being gaslit, of doubting my own perceptions, of being made to feel like I was crazy or oversensitive. The physical effects of chronic low-level poisoning, the violation of trust that came with realizing someone had been systematically drugging me while pretending to care about my well-being. But we survived it. We came through stronger, with better communication skills, and a deeper understanding of how abuse can hide behind the mask of family loyalty. A year after Bob's sentencing, Jake and I renewed our wedding vows in a small ceremony with just our closest friends and my family. We'd bought a new house on the other side of Austin, far from Westlake Hills and the memories there. We were expecting our first child, a daughter we planned to name Hope. The day we found out we were pregnant, I got a call from a blocked number. Prison calls are always blocked, so I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Barbara?" Bob's voice was weak, defeated. He'd aged years in the months since his arrest. "Congratulations on the baby," Jake told my lawyer. I should have hung up immediately. Instead, I found myself listening to the man who had tried to destroy my life. "I know you'll never forgive me," he continued. "I know I lost my son forever because of what I did. But I want you to know, I want you to understand. I never meant for it to go so far." "Yes, you did," I said calmly. "Every step was calculated. Every dose was measured. Every lie was planned. You knew exactly what you were doing." There was a long silence. Then, "Maybe you're right. Maybe I just can't admit how far I'd fallen. But I lost everything, Barbara. My son, my reputation, my freedom. I lost everything because I couldn't let go." "You threw it all away," I corrected him. "You had a son who loved you, who would have happily included you in his new family. You had respect in the community, a comfortable retirement, a chance to be a grandfather. But that wasn't enough for you. You needed to own Jake completely. I know. God help me, I know that now. But it's too late, isn't it?" "Yes," I said simply. "It is. Will you tell him I'm sorry? Will you tell him I know what I did was unforgivable, but that I'm sorry anyway?" I considered that request for a long moment. Jake was doing well in therapy, building a life free from his father's toxic influence. Did he need to hear his father's apology? Would it help or hurt? "I'll think about it," I said finally. "Thank you, and Barbara, take care of him. Love him the way I should have learned to. Let him be happy." That was the last time I ever spoke to Bob Mitchell. Today, 3 years later, Jake and I have 2 beautiful children and a marriage built on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. Jake has learned to recognize the signs of manipulation and control. I've learned to trust my instincts and speak up when something feels wrong. We still live in Austin, but in a different neighborhood where no one knows our story. We're just another young family working hard, raising kids, and building a life together. Normal problems, normal joys, normal challenges. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm feeding the baby or checking on our toddler, I think about what Bob said in that last phone call, about losing everything because he couldn't let go. Because that's what abuse really is. The inability to let the people you claim to love be happy in their own way. The need to control others to fill some void in yourself. The willingness to destroy what you claim to protect rather than risk losing it. Bob had convinced himself that he was protecting his family, defending his son, preserving important traditions. But really, he was just a man so terrified of being alone that he was willing to murder and poison to avoid abandonment. If you're reading this story and recognizing patterns in your own life, please know that you're not imagining things. You're not too sensitive. You're not crazy. Trust your instincts. Document what you can. Find people who will believe and support you. And remember that anyone who truly loves you will want you to be safe, healthy, and happy. Not sick, scared, and dependent on their approval. Real love doesn't come with conditions. Real love doesn't require you to shrink yourself or accept harm. Real love doesn't poison people to prove points about worthiness. Real love sets you free to be yourself, supports your growth, and celebrates your independence. Everything else is just control wearing a mask of affection. Bob Mitchell spent his life trying to control the people he claimed to love most. In the end, all he accomplished was losing them forever and destroying himself in the process. That's the real tragedy of abuse. It doesn't just hurt the victims, it ultimately destroys the abuser too, leaving everyone damaged and alone. But there's hope on the other side. Jake and I are living proof that you can survive, heal, and build something beautiful from the ashes of a toxic situation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even when that someone is family, even when they claim everything they do comes from love. Because love isn't about ownership. Love is about freedom, and sometimes the only way to save a relationship, or save yourself, is to have the courage to walk away from the poison and choose something healthier. We chose each other. We chose truth over comfort, healing over tradition, growth over stagnation, and we chose life over the slow death that Bob had planned for all of us. That choice saved us. It can save you too.